The Mercer plantation spread across 3,000 acres of Georgia lowland, a place where the red clay seemed to hold secrets the way soil holds water. On the morning of October 14, 1847, a neighbor's boy rode up to the main house to deliver word about the county fair and stumbled upon something that would haunt the region for generations. The dining room table was still laid out. The food had gone cold. The candles had burned themselves down to stubs. And the chairs sat vacant. But the family was nowhere to be found, vanished without a trace. No sign of a struggle, no note left behind, not a single word of explanation. Just an abandoned meal, and a mystery that would give rise to 100 theories. None of them quite convincing, and all of them somehow more disturbing than the one before. Before we go further into the story of the Mercer family and the night they disappeared from their own home, if you're listening from somewhere in the South, or if you've ever found yourself wondering about the families who vanished without explanation in American history, let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop your state in the comments. I want to see whether this story reaches people who live near the very places where these mysteries played out. And if you're already feeling the chill of this, hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to uncover what truly happened inside that plantation house. The Mercer family wasn't particularly distinguished in the world of Georgia planter society. Thomas Mercer had inherited the plantation from his father, along with the considerable debts that came attached to it. He was a man of 43 with the kind of face that suggested a lifetime spent running numbers. His eyes were sharp, always shifting, always measuring. His wife, Elenina, was 10 years younger, a woman from a Charleston merchant family who had married beneath her in status, but above her in land. She had the kind of beauty that came from constant upkeep. Her dark hair was always pinned just so. Her dresses were always the finest money could buy, and her smile never quite made it to her eyes. They had 3 children. Catherine, the eldest daughter, was 19 and had been promised to a neighboring planter's son. A match that would have brought 2 significant properties together. She was quiet, the kind of girl who seemed to take everything in rather than engage with it, and she had her mother's careful beauty paired with her father's calculating gaze. Then there was William, 17, who had been groomed since birth to inherit the plantation. He was handsome the way young men often are, carrying an easy confidence that suggested he had never once questioned his place in the world. The youngest was Margaret, just 14, still caught somewhere between childhood and whatever came after. She was the only one of the 3 who seemed to laugh with any real feeling. The plantation itself was an expansive affair. The main house was built in the Federal style with white columns and a wraparound porch that caught the light in the afternoon. It had been added onto twice since its original construction in 1789, and those additions gave it a lopsided quality, as if the building itself could never quite settle on what it wanted to be. The grounds were kept immaculate. The lawn was cropped short, the gardens trimmed back, the outbuildings whitewashed and neat. Everything about the Mercer plantation spoke of control, precision, and wealth carefully managed. But control, as anyone who has lived in the South knows, is always something of an illusion. The household staff consisted of roughly 40 enslaved people, though that number shifted over time. There was a head housekeeper named Ruth who had been with the family for 23 years and who ran the domestic side of things with an iron hand that rivaled Elenina's. There was a cook named Samuel who had trained in Charleston and who took a quiet pride in his work. The meals that came out of his kitchen were regarded as some of the finest in the county. There were field hands, stable workers, a blacksmith, a carpenter, and various others whose names and faces were known only to those who lived and labored among them. The night of October 13, 1847, was unremarkable in almost every respect. The weather was mild for October, warm enough that the evening air felt almost like summer, though there was a dampness to it that hinted rain was coming. The family had gathered for dinner at 7 o'clock, as they always did. Samuel had prepared a meal of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread baked that same morning, and a custard for dessert. The dining room was lit by candlelight. Gas lighting had not yet reached this part of Georgia, and the table was set with the family's good china, the pieces reserved for occasions when they wanted to make an impression. But there was no guest that evening. No visiting relative, no neighbor dropping by, no occasion that called for the good china. Elenina had simply decided, according to Ruth's testimony, that they would dine formally. It was a Tuesday. Nothing about it suggested it would be anything other than an ordinary evening. The family sat down to eat at 7. Ruth served the meal and then withdrew to the kitchen, as was customary. Samuel was there along with 2 younger servants who helped with the washing and clearing. The dining room door was shut, as it always was during meals. The family preferred privacy while they ate, and the servants knew better than to interrupt unless they were called upon. At 8:30, Ruth went to clear the first course. She knocked on the dining room door as was proper and received no answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. She opened the door slowly, expecting to find them still at the table, perhaps deep in conversation, perhaps having lost track of the hour. What she found instead was a scene that would be described in various accounts as unnatural, impossible, as if the family had simply ceased to exist. The table was exactly as it had been. The first course had been cleared, meaning the family had eaten at least that much. But the main course was still sitting there. The chicken had cooled to room temperature. The vegetables had begun to wilt. The bread had gone hard. The candles had burned down considerably, suggesting that a good deal of time had passed. But the chairs were empty. All of them. Thomas, Elenina, Catherine, and William. Margaret's chair was empty too, though her plate had barely been touched. The room was undisturbed. The windows were closed and latched from the inside. The door Ruth had just come through was the only way in or out, and no one had passed through it. The candlestick still stood upright. The tablecloth showed no signs of a struggle. It was as though the family had simply risen from their chairs and walked away, leaving everything exactly where it was. Ruth's scream brought Samuel running. He found her standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her face the color of old parchment. The other servants came behind him, and within minutes the entire household knew that something inexplicable had taken place. The search began right away. The house was gone through room by room. Every closet, every space large enough to conceal a person. The grounds were searched by torchlight and lantern as darkness settled in. The nearby woods were combed. The river running along the eastern edge of the property was checked, though no bodies turned up. By midnight, neighbors had been called in, and by dawn, a search party of nearly 50 men was moving across the countryside looking for any trace of the missing family. They found nothing. The county sheriff arrived on the morning of October 15th. His name was James Harrow, and he was a man who had held that position for 12 years without ever coming across anything that truly puzzled him. Most crimes in the county were straightforward. A stolen horse, a fight between drunk men, the occasional theft. He was accustomed to simple explanations and simple resolutions. The Mercer disappearance was neither. Harrow was a methodical man. He interviewed Ruth first, in the kitchen, with Samuel present. Her account was consistent and detailed. She described the family sitting down to dinner, the meal being served, the door being closed. She described the sounds from the dining room, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, nothing out of the ordinary. She described the silence that had settled around 8 o'clock, which she had taken to mean they were finishing their meal. She described opening the door and finding the room vacant. "Did you see them leave?" Harrow asked. "No, sir, I did not." "Could they have gone through the windows?" "The windows were latched from the inside, sir." "I checked myself." "Could they have come through the kitchen?" "No, sir. I was in the kitchen the entire time. No one came through." Harrow interviewed the other servants. Their accounts lined up with Ruth's. Nobody had seen the family leave the dining room. Nobody had heard anything suggesting distress or a struggle. It was as if they had simply disappeared. Harrow then examined the dining room himself. He was looking for signs of violence, for evidence of a struggle, for anything that might point to what had happened. He found nothing. The room was orderly. The table was set. The food was there. The candles had burned low, suggesting the family had been in the room for some time after sitting down, but there was no accounting for their absence. He spoke with the neighbors who had taken part in the initial search. They confirmed that the house had been gone through thoroughly, that no bodies had turned up, that there was no sign of the family anywhere on the grounds. One neighbor, a man named Garrett, pointed out something odd. The horses in the stable were still there. Every one of them. If the family had run, they would have taken horses. But the horses remained undisturbed in their stalls. That detail troubled Harrow. It suggested the family had not left of their own accord. But if they hadn't, then where were they? In the days that followed, Harrow interviewed everyone connected to the household. He spoke with the enslaved people who worked the plantation, though his conversations with them were brief. He seemed to assume they would have nothing useful to offer, or that if they did, they would be unlikely to share it with a white lawman. He spoke with neighbors, with distant relatives, with the men Catherine had been promised to, a planter named Hutchkins who lived 5 miles away. Hutchkins appeared genuinely shaken by the news and expressed concern for Catherine's well-being, though something in his manner suggested his concern was primarily about money. The marriage would have brought him considerable property. A week after the disappearance, Harrow made a public announcement. He stated that the Mercer family had vanished under mysterious circumstances, that foul play could not be ruled out, and that anyone with information should come forward. He offered a reward of $50 for information leading to the discovery of the family's whereabouts. In 1847, $50 was a serious sum, enough to feed a family for several months. No one came forward. The weeks became months. The search was gradually wound down. The reward went unclaimed. The Mercer plantation fell into a kind of limbo. The enslaved people who worked there were technically still the property of Thomas Mercer, but with no master to give them direction, they were in an impossible position. Some stayed on the plantation, carrying on their work out of habit or out of fear of what might happen if they left. Others drifted away, disappearing into the countryside or making their way to larger towns where they might find work or some measure of anonymity. The house itself began to fall apart. Without Elenina's careful management and the servants' daily attention, the gardens ran wild. The paint on the columns began to peel. The wraparound porch developed rot. The interior, once so meticulously kept, began to show signs of neglect. Dust gathered on the furniture. The curtains faded in the sun. The dining room, where the family had vanished, became a place people avoided. The table was left exactly as it had been found, as if moving it might somehow erase the last evidence of what had taken place. By the end of 1847, the Mercer disappearance had become a local legend. People told stories about what had happened that night. Some said the family had been taken by spirits, a punishment for some sin they had committed. Others suggested they had been spirited away by abolitionists and taken north. Still others whispered about curses, about the land itself rejecting those who worked it, about debts settled in blood rather than coin. But the truth, as is so often the case, was far more complicated and far more human. To understand what happened to the Mercer family, you first have to understand the nature of the household they lived in. On the surface it was a place of order and control. But beneath that surface, like rot hidden under polished wood, there were fractures that had been widening for years. Thomas Mercer's financial situation was far more precarious than most people realized. The plantation turned a profit, yes, but not enough to support the lifestyle Elenina demanded. She came from a merchant family, people accustomed to comfort and luxury, and she had no intention of living as a mere planter's wife. She wanted the finest things. The best clothes. The most impressive entertainments. Thomas had given her what she wanted, and in doing so he had accumulated debts that were becoming harder and harder to manage. By 1847, Thomas owed money to 3 different creditors in Savannah, a banker in Charleston, and a merchant in Atlanta. The debts were substantial, and the creditors were losing patience. Letters had begun to arrive, letters that grew increasingly threatening in tone. There was talk of foreclosure, of the plantation being seized to satisfy what was owed. Thomas had started drinking more heavily, something noted by those who saw him around town. He had become withdrawn, irritable, prone to sudden bursts of rage followed by long stretches of dark silence. Elenina, for her part, seemed oblivious to the financial crisis. Or perhaps she was not oblivious at all. Perhaps she simply refused to acknowledge it. She kept ordering expensive fabrics from Charleston. She kept planning elaborate entertainments. She kept living as though the money would never run out, as though the debts were merely a temporary inconvenience that Thomas would somehow sort out. Catherine, the eldest daughter, was aware of the situation. She was sharp and observant, and she had overheard enough conversations between her parents to understand the true state of things. She knew that her engagement to Hutchkins was not a love match but a financial arrangement, a way of consolidating properties and securing the family's future. She had accepted this, as young women of her class were expected to accept such things. But she had also begun to understand that her future was not as secure as she had once believed. William, the heir, was less aware of the crisis, or perhaps he simply preferred not to think about it. He was 17, sure of his place in the world, convinced that he would inherit the plantation and that everything would work itself out. He had no real grasp of the debts, no understanding of what it meant to be responsible for an enterprise of that size. He spent his time riding and hunting and socializing with other young men of his station. He had a girl he was sweet on, from a neighboring plantation, and he was already laying plans for a future that assumed the plantation would be waiting for him, stable and profitable, when the time came. Margaret, the youngest, was largely untouched by any of it. At 14 she still lived in the world of childhood, still believed her parents were capable of solving any problem, that things would always be as they were. But there was something else running beneath the surface of that household. A secret that had been kept for years. A secret with the power to destroy everything. The family's reputation, their standing in society, their very place in the world. Ruth knew this secret. She had known it for years and she had kept it because she had no choice.